have surveyed for 14 years about 1,000 teenagers about drug use, licit and illicit, and among their questions is one that asks these students how easy or difficult it is for them to obtain cannabis and other drugs. And across the years, a higher percentage of students report that it's easiest for them to buy marijuana than report it's easiest for them to buy beer. So that finding's a curious one, and it suggests that there's some greater degree of societal control over drug use may be possible with drugs that are legally regulated, for example, with age restrictions that the government can actually enforce, as compared to drugs that remain unregulated in the illicit market. And then finally, in California, when voters passed Proposition 215 that made medical marijuana available in 1996, some people worried that this would increase both the availability and the acceptability of marijuana, and that in turn would cause an increase in marijuana use by young people. And now we have literally hundreds of medical marijuana dispensaries in the state and several 100,000 medical marijuana patients. But use hasn't increased. The sample of students that were surveyed in the 7th, 9th, and 11th grades is quite reassuring. There were no statistically significant increases in marijuana use among California students after voters passed medical marijuana. Rather, use of marijuana generally declined for a decade after passage of medical marijuana. And the most recent of these surveys showed that the prevalence of marijuana use remains significantly lower than it was prior to the passage of medical marijuana 15 years ago. I've asked your committee staff to make available my testimony at the end of which, the written form, at the end of which I give all the citations if you would care to look at these things further. And I would be happy to take any questions, try to answer them.
Thank you. I don't see a lot of questions. I think people might have more after they review the written materials, and hopefully we can contact you if we do.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. We'll now move to the third panel. Don Pierce from the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, and Seth Dawson from the Washington Association for Substance Abuse Prevention.
Mr. Chairman, Don Pierce with the Sheriffs and Police Chiefs Association, and I've been well trained by the chair of this committee and his predecessors that this is a fiscal committee, and so I will try to restrict my comments to the fiscal impacts of this bill. The first thing that I would like to point out is that I think former U.S. Attorney John McKay made an excellent point, and I know the proponents of the bill in the policy committee discussed this a little bit more, and that is that we do have a problem with this bill as it relates to federal law. And I think there is an acknowledgement that any application of the law would take some time, that Washington State could be a leader, but there could be some adjudication and there could be some wait to see what the federal government did. I think that has an impact on the fiscal impact. It certainly impacts the timeline of any revenue that you might see from this. So I don't believe that the timeline that you've been presented is accurate. Additionally, Mr. McKay also indicated that in the initial stages at least, and I think continuing, you would see a pretty robust black and what I would call a gray market that would continue. You can grow your own. If I could make Jack Daniels in my garage and avoid paying the tax and paying the profits, I probably would, but I can't. Folks can grow marijuana relatively easily. And free is still cheaper than whatever the state would sell it for in a liquor store. I believe that the current costs for the enforcement of marijuana laws tend to be greatly exaggerated. There are no prisoners, or if there are very few prisoners currently in our jails or in our prison that are there for simple possession. There may be a simple possession charge pending against them, and they may have been sentenced as part of what they did for simple possession, but there are other charges that go along with that. I was a police chief for 25 years before I started this job, most recently in the state of Washington for 12 years in Bellingham. And I can tell you that we didn't spend the kinds of money that you see reported for the enforcement of marijuana. In terms of booking them into jail, it was a cite and release, not so much a matter of a well-thought-out policy, but as a matter of overcrowded jails. I call your attention to the RAND study. The RAND Corporation did review California's measure to legalize marijuana, and they determined that the revenue estimates were greatly exaggerated and speculative at best. In terms of what we saw in Amsterdam, and to reiterate the point that the black market will not go away, there were 3 known organized crime drug rings in Amsterdam prior to the legalization of the marijuana cafes. Currently, there are 93, and I think there's a direct correlation between those two stats. Another crime that we can expect to see exponentially increased is drug driving. We already currently see a problem with this. Hospital emergency rooms report the presence of illegal substance and alcohol on a fairly regular basis, and the victims of traffic crashes. It's interesting that we had a panel from the city of Seattle because I had about 12 hours to prepare for this, and I turned to the former police chief from the city of Seattle, no, not Norm Stamper, but Gil Kurlikowski, and some of the information that he's presented is quite compelling. We take a look at alcohol, and I understand that alcohol is not the same substance as marijuana, but federally there's about $9 billion in excise tax collected from alcohol. States collect about $5.5 billion, yet the costs to the state and federal government is $185 billion. So for every dollar that you receive from that substance, you spend 10. Tobacco is very similar, and there are a number of individuals, including the folks at the ONDCP, that believe we would see the same results with marijuana that we've seen with alcohol and tobacco. Finally, I'd say we're lucky that most of the folks in our country obey the law simply because it's against the law. And I think that intuitively we know that if it were made legal, more people would use the substance. And I also believe that we'd see increased uses with children. With that, I'll turn it over to Seth.
Seth?
Good afternoon. My name is Seth Dawson. I'm speaking on behalf of the Washington Association for Substance Abuse Prevention. First of all, let me second the comments made by Don Pierce. Based on my 18 years experience as a prosecuting attorney of criminal cases, including 12 years as the elected prosecuting attorney in Snohomish County, we appreciate the opportunity to address this issue from the standpoint of children. And we'd ask you to remember that our children watch what we do and listen to what we say and act accordingly oftentimes. I want to call your attention to a front page article in the Seattle Times from 2 years ago. I'll just read briefly. The increase in teen smoking pot is partly because the national debate over medical use of marijuana can make the drug seem safer to teenagers, researchers said. And I've given you a number of studies and other information on that very point. To us, it's inconceivable that we could legalize marijuana and yet not see children use it more. And in fact, if just discussions and enactments on medical use of marijuana has that effect of more usage because kids think it's not as dangerous, then certainly enactments of legalization would have the same effect. And we know that marijuana use by children is harmful. In addition, we have the concerns that have been voiced regarding California. We know that price equals higher consumption, at least if the price goes down, and that's especially true among youth. In California, it was estimated that had that proposition passed, the untaxed retail price of high-quality marijuana could have dropped as low as $38 an ounce compared to about $375 per ounce today. In addition, we're not convinced that regulation is a good way to protect kids from use of marijuana. Alcohol is legal and it is regulated, and yet youth use it at much higher rates than they do marijuana, according to the Washington State Healthy Youth Survey, for example. Most minors get alcohol from people they know, friends, acquaintances, and others. And if marijuana is sold right next to alcohol, we expect they would likewise have greater access to that as well. And last, as has been said, fortunately, most people obey the law. Certainly there are some adults who do not use marijuana because it is illegal. If it is legalized, safe to assume more people will use it, including parents. And then that sets the example for the children in the home. Parents are the primary role models for their children, and we'd ask that that be taken into account as well. Be happy to follow up. I know you're short on time, but individually I would follow up with any questions on either the prosecution experience I've had that's relevant or the information that we presented in writing.
Thank you. Representative Hague, you had a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I represent Mason County, and I know, I mean, when I showed up there 30 years ago, a lot of people were growing it. It was pretty much everywhere, and I know that there was at one time a lot of work being done, and I'm sure a lot of time and money spent on finding and busting those places where marijuana was being grown. I haven't heard that much lately. Is there any, I mean, is the Sheriff's Department actually backing off of seeking out and destroying the crop growing operations because of some of the changes that are going on around, and possible changes around the use of marijuana?
I believe so, and that's certainly, as I'm well aware, and I suspect you are, there are 39 elected sheriffs who set the policy for their sheriff's offices. But we have seen a de-emphasis of the kind of enforcement that you describe, certainly over the course of my career. I started my career as a police officer in Pullman, and I don't see the officers there enforcing the law the way that we did then. Where we do spend the majority of our resource, and interestingly it comes from the federal government, is trying to detect and stop the large marijuana grow operations that quite frankly are destroying some of our public lands because of environmental concerns and because of simply out of control criminals, oftentimes by drug cartels. And so we are concentrating our efforts on the big, large, organized drug grow operations. Very little time is spent on the mom and pop garden.
Thank you. And now we'll go to the final panel, and we have Matt McCauley, a former probation officer, George Rohrabacher, former Washington State Senator, and Heather Villanueva from SEIU. It's always nice to have a former senator here.
Yeah. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the panel. My name is Matthew McCauley. I represent LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, the nation and the world's largest group of criminal justice professionals pledged to end the war on drugs. Ms. Dickerson's aide asked me to refute some of what had just been said at this table a moment ago, and